This is the Tree of Life, Season 3, Chapter 6. In this episode, we will be talking about human evolution and anthropology in light of the last episode of this season. What we can see from the last episode is that spatial non-consensual actors are selecting for sublimation in potential partners regardless of whether they actually mate with the individual. The more successful at sublimating a spatial non-consensual actor's expectations a given archetypal consensual actor becomes, the more choice they ultimately have as to potential partners. It also means that they acquire, or accumulate, the spatial territoriality of those partners, with the ability to pass it on to their children through archetypal assignments. What this means in practice is that the anthropological success of humanity in becoming an agrarian species depended upon this division of roles within society, as between spatial non-consensual and archetypal consensual actors, and the ability of archetypal consensual actors to sublimate the sexual expectations of their non-consensual partners into archetypal role assignments provided to offspring in early development. The first step in passing on that archetypal assignment to offspring involved the linking of sublimating language to objects of social emotional relevance for the archetypal consensual actor and spatial non-consensual actor. Which is to say that this linking between the two actors manifests as a linking of states of arousal. This process could also be described as the integration of the spatial non-consensual actor into an archetypal constellation, as described in Season 3, Chapter 1, since much of the time the objects of social emotional relevance to an actor are other actors. The second step involved the linking of those objects of social emotional relevance to the archetypal consensual actor, to the spatial objects, within the life of the offspring through an archetypal designation. In other words, when Homo sapiens began sacrificing reproductive success, that is, number of offspring, for the quality of those offspring, that is, when they began to sublimate to consolidate territory within families, they became agrarian. In other words, intellectual feudalism, as we called it in a previous episode, led to actual feudalism. In other words, the development of Homo sapiens into modern humans didn't begin in earnest until there was specialization between archetypal consensual actors and spatial non-consensual actors. That is, when people developed the ability to sublimate or defer the sexual expectations of each other and transmit that sublimation to their children through archetypal designations amongst lineal lines. Which is to say, that the sublimation as between parent and child is of a fundamentally different character than as between spatial non-consensual and archetypal consensual partner. Between linearly related individuals, the displacement of one by the other produces expectation matching spatially as opposed to sexually. In other words, whereas a spatial non-consensual actor's displacement of the archetypal consensual actor produces expectation matching that relates to sexual expectations. Within a lineal line, the expectations met are primarily spatially anchored. This follows from the fact explained in a preceding episode, that the archetypal as symbolic plates have a quality of spatial dimensionality to them. Of course, the role of language in the process of transformation of spatial territoriality into archetypal consolidation, of remes into memes, cannot be overstated. In order for the sublimation to be effective, the language must have a certain structure, it must be capable of symbolic representation, and linking between spatial objects of linearly related individuals. In other words, the key ingredient to the process is the telescopic effect, the linking of spatial objects amongst local lateral alters to symbolic representations of those higher in the lineal hierarchy. It is the conservation of analogous action relative to distinct objects, at the local, spatial objects, at the higher levels, symbolic objects, that produces the passing of archetypal consensuality along linearly. This shows that superstitious practices, such as ritual and spirituality, played a key role in the development of archetypal consensuality and the sublimating practices necessary to produce it. That's the end of the podcast for today.